I have a confession to make. I may have been wrong. Well, sort of. A couple months ago, I posted a video titled, Why Zeonic Front is the Greatest Gundam Game Ever. It featured Mobile Suit Gundam Zeonic Front, the iconic title based on the franchise known for its fun, albeit sometimes difficult gameplay that focuses on experiencing some of the battles of the One-Year War from the Zeon perspective in a bit more realistic of fashion than most Gundam games. It's without a doubt a top 5 Gundam game in my opinion, and I don't think you'll find many who disagree with that statement. But is it actually the best? Well, I've been playing another title recently that has me pondering that very question.
Zeta Gundam, Kamille, let's do it!
Mobile Suit Gundam, Gundam vs. Zeta Gundam. Oh man, where to even begin with this one? I'd like to start off by saying that as I poured hours and hours into Gundam vs. Zeta Gundam, there was another game that kept popping into my head for comparison. It's one that I hold very dear to my heart, and actually isn't even a Gundam game at all. But the more and more I played, the more I began to think that Gundam vs. Zeta is, to the Gundam gaming universe, the same or at least similar in fashion to what Budokai Tenkaichi 3 is to the Dragon Ball gaming space. Tenkaichi 3 is absolutely enormous with its huge character roster and tons of fan service. You won't find many Dragon Ball fans who don't adore it. In fact, many regard it as the greatest Dragon Ball game to date, and its gameplay holds up surprisingly well. Hell, there's even an active modding community for it. Gundam vs. Zeta Gundam gives me very similar vibes. There's just a plethora of things that will make any Gundam fan smile. As a matter of fact, I would say that if you're a Universal Century fan, you absolutely must play it. That's not to say it's perfect, and we'll get into the couple of minor gripes I had with it later, but it's very worth experiencing for yourself.
But why?
Gundam vs. Zeta Gundam is huge, even if it doesn't appear to be at first glance. Upon loading up the game modes offered seem, well, fairly standard. You've got Universal Century Mode, the game's equivalent of Story Mode, Arcade, Versus Battle, Survival, and Training. There's also a collection mode where you can use points you've earned during gameplay to unlock all sorts of various things. Mobile suits for your gallery, music, movies, and more. Neat, but there's so much more than meets the eye here, particularly in Universal Century Mode, which is what we're going to look at first. There are 3 selections offered upon accessing the mode that represent playable factions: the Aeug, Titans, and Axis, aka Zeon. Upon initially accessing a faction, we're given a brief introductory bit of gameplay and cutscene before being set loose upon the mission layout board, where you can then proceed to move mission by mission through the story of Zeta Gundam from the perspective of whichever faction you chose. It's worth noting that the storytelling here is much different than previous games like Journey to Jaburo or Encounters in Space, which I would say explain the story fantastically in a way that is almost equivalent to watching the anime. Gundam vs. Zeta doesn't tell the story in quite as much detail, and it's one of its shortcomings. There aren't cutscenes that play prior to each scenario. Instead, the story is told via text on the mission select screen and in the mission itself. The only exception is when you finish a story path. This isn't really a problem if you're already familiar with the story of Gundam and Zeta Gundam. Honestly, some might even see it as a breath of fresh air to just be able to immediately hop into the action. But if you've never seen either show, you may be left wondering exactly what's going on in some situations. But there's a very good reason for this apparent lack of detail. There's just way too much to cover for a cutscene before every mission format to be viable. After completing your first run-through of the vanilla story of Zeta, in this example we're looking at it from Kamille's perspective, which has a rather unfortunate end for our protagonist, you see that there were other choices that could be made, and that maybe those choices could change the outcome of events. This is where the real meat of Universal Century Mode is found: variation. And not just in the events of the Grips War, but the One-Year War as well. This is Gundam vs. Zeta Gundam after all. Certain missions can have different outcomes that unlock alternate paths that vary from how the story is supposed to go according to the show's canon. Unlocking these alternate paths has various requirements, from destroying or not destroying certain targets, to surviving, or maybe even just letting certain characters die. Before long, your mission board becomes filled with all sorts of crisscrossing paths of various events that are altering the course of the Universal Century's history. There are some absolutely crazy scenarios, and they aren't just small little changes. Certain events unfolding differently in the One-Year War can have serious implications on the story of Zeta Gundam, completely changing the outcome of the Grips War and extending even further into the future. Like, what if Lalah survived with the remnants of Zeon? Would her and Char together be able to stop the Titans? What would the outcome look like if Sirocco was stopped by Lalah during Operation Apollo? Would Kamille's fate be different if they'd been able to stop Sirocco then too? Would it change the ending of Zeta? Or what if 4 survived and helped the Aeug fight against the Titans in her Psycho Gundam alongside Kamille? How about if Amuro joined the Aeug from the very beginning? There are way too many possibilities to name them all, but as you continue to progress through the Aeug, Titan, and Zeon stories, more scenarios present themselves. All the variations and outcomes really add to the game's replayability factor, and the more you play, the more you unlock. I can't stress enough just how cool it was to be able to see how all these different scenarios unfold. Ever since I first watched 0079 Gundam, I always wondered how different things would be if Lalah hadn't died. Seeing her continue on into the story of Zeta in the cockpit of a Kamille was a truly unique experience that I'm thankful the game offered. You unlock a ton of different playable suits and armors as you progress, from the OG RX-78-2 to the Gundam Mark II, Zeta Gundam, Hyaku Shiki, Char Zaku 2, Lala's Elmeth, the Big Zom, Zhang, Psycho Gundam, and so many more. If there's ever been a character you wanted to take control of and pilot a mobile suit with from either show, chances are they're playable. The roster of characters and suits is just enormous. To my surprise, even the double Zeta Gundam makes an appearance. Additionally, as you progress, you earn points that can be spent to upgrade your suits, making them more effective in battle. There's no real customization or anything here, it's just a straight up upgrade, but it's definitely worth doing to increase the combat effectiveness of a suit if you find yourself using it often. The gameplay was much more challenging than I anticipated going into it, with some fights being really brutal, particularly those that took place in 0G, but I think a lot of that is due to the somewhat clunky movement while in space. I think encounters in space did a far better job here, but that's understandable since the entire game is designed around 0G combat. Regardless though, Sirocco still kicked my ass a number of times before I finally defeated them. Personally, I much preferred the fights that took place while grounded. I found enemy movements far easier to predict and gameplay just felt smoother overall. Regardless of where the battles were taking place though, one thing that definitely took some getting used to was the targeting system. This was one of my few gripes with the game. When you approach and lock an enemy, your target lock icon will turn red if they are within range and damageable. If you fire and hit the enemy, you'll succeed in dealing damage. However, when an enemy is knocked down or recently heavily damaged and staggered, the targeting icon will turn yellow. During this time, if you fire at the enemy, even if you watch your attack connect with them, no damage occurs. This means you can't continue attacking enemies that are knocked down on the ground, which, I get it, if you could spam attacks on knockdown enemies, the game would probably be too easy. My problem with it though is that the undamageable yellow targeting window extends pretty long in some cases, making combat a bit unpredictable and allowing the CPU to essentially attack you for free right out of their invincibility frames, with you not being really able to do anything about it besides dodge or just sit back and wait for them to come out of that window. During these windows they also can't be staggered either, and it could really be a pain in the ass sometimes. Again, it was something that I got used to over time, and I was able to fairly accurately predict how long this window would last by the time I finished my gameplay, but I was really thrown off by it during my first few play sessions. Before we move on to discussing the other game mode offerings, while we're talking gripes, I'd like to just briefly discuss the other one I had, Friendly Fire. I don't really know what the benefit of having friendly fire turned on is, and it was definitely frustrating at times. Whether it was allies getting in the way of my shots or melee attacks, taking damage, sometimes even dying and using up my Recover Awakening ability, which we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, or when my allies were firing at enemies, sometimes hitting me, interrupting melee combos, or otherwise disturbing an attack I was about to land. I was really left wondering why a Gundam game that doesn't necessarily strive for realism in most aspects had friendly fire turned on. It wasn't a huge issue, but there were times when I would have preferred to just be solo. In addition to the game's expansive Universal Century mode, there's also an arcade mode, versus mode, and survival mode. Arcade mode allows you to play through various sets of missions or routes that have varying degrees of difficulty. Versus mode is pretty self-explanatory. You can choose your mobile suit and stage and face off against either auto-selected or pre-selected enemies. Survival mode is just that, survival mode. It plays out sort of like arcade mode in that you progress through various missions, but it keeps going indefinitely until you fail. All these add a bit to the replayability factor of the game and offer opportunities to use the various mobile suits offered in the impressive roster. Next, I'd like to talk about gameplay. Across all game modes, the overall gameplay experience feels pretty similar. You load into a map with at least one ally and proceed to engage enemies. There are a decent amount of possible stages, but eventually you'll get familiar with all of them, especially if you've spent a good amount of time in Universal Century mode. I couldn't tell you how many battles I've fought at Abawaku at this point. Eventually, even enemy spawn patterns become recognizable, and they seem to stay the same for each respective map, regardless of what mission you're on, even if it is a different era of mobile suits that are spawning in to fight against you. In combat, both ranged and melee combat are equally effective, depending on which mobile suit you're using. One thing that's common across essentially all suits, with the exception of maybe a Zaku using a machine gun or other reloadable weapon, is ammo scarcity. You definitely want to be careful and precise with your shots, as it's easy to quickly run through your available ammo if you're just spamming away. Beam rifle shots do slowly recharge over time, but it's best to be as precise as possible. Certain suits, such as the aforementioned Zaku or even the Gundam Mark II, do have reloading mechanics, but the majority of suits have ammunition that slowly recharges over time. The majority of available suits also have a secondary attack, such as Vulcan cannons or grenades that complement your main arsenal. Depending on the particular weapon, they can be handy for finishing off near-to-death opponents to help preserve your primary ammunition count. There are even some suits, such as the Kamille or Elmeth, that offer funnel mechanics, allowing you to deploy funnels out to engage enemies. In the case of the Kamille, this is in addition to its beam weaponry armament, making it a real force to be reckoned with. There are more examples of suits that have special attacks that deviate from the standard Vulcan cannons, such as the Gouf's Heat Rod, and in all cases, these special attacks replace your standard secondary attack. Many suits, particularly during the Grips War era, offer the ability to transform, like the Zeta Gundam for example. If you're piloting a suit that has the capability to do so, you can jump and hold dash in the air to quickly transform and fly away, or maneuver around until you run out of available boost gauge. This can be particularly effective for getting away from enemies. AI Kamille uses this tactic a lot when you fight against them, making him a real pain in the ass sometimes. There's also a mechanic featured in the game called the Awaken system. Prior to each mission, you choose from either the Assault, Revival, or Mobility Awaken abilities. There's a gauge in the upper left-hand corner that slowly fills as you play through missions, and once full can be activated by the player. You can choose to activate Assault or Mobility at any time when the meter is full, while Revival is activated automatically and is not controlled by the player. Activating Assault gives you and your allies an attack power bonus, as well as a slight speed increase. Also, you can't be stunned or knocked down while Assault is active. It lasts somewhere around 10 seconds. Mobility lasts around 20 seconds and gives you a significant speed boost. Personally, I found this to be the weakest. Revival is activated automatically when either you or an ally takes what would be a killing blow. Instead of being destroyed and getting a mission failed, you come back with around a quarter of your health remaining and potentially a limb missing depending on where you took damage. I ran with Revival for the majority of my gameplay, and while it could be powerful at times, at others it was a bit frustrating. Like when you're about to die, but your ally dies just before you, eating up your Revival, or when your ally gets in the way and dies to your own friendly fire, also eating up your Revival. Overall, the gameplay of Gundam vs. Zeta Gundam is quite enjoyable. Its difficulty strikes a nice balance between too easy and too hard, although there are some parts that are definitely challenging. As mentioned earlier, if you're a fan of Universal Century Gundam, I would highly recommend checking it out. All the what-if scenarios are an absolute blast to play through, and you can easily sink in somewhere around 30 hours or even more trying to unlock them all. If you're a fan of the series, I don't think you'll get bored along the way either. Is Gundam vs. Zeta the best Gundam game though, at the very least on the PlayStation 2? That's a tough question. All the different what-ifs and their outcomes offer something truly unique, and combined with the mobile suits and character rosters, make it a serious contender. The game is great at a lot of things, but as mentioned earlier, storytelling isn't particularly one of them. I think Journey to Jaburo and Encounters in Space do a better job at retelling the story of the anime. And for simulating the experience of piloting a Zaku, I think Zeonic Front still takes the crown there. But those games also don't offer anywhere near the variety of gameplay or roster that Gundam vs. Zeta does, among other things. Your personal best Gundam game, on the PlayStation 2 console or any other system for that matter, is going to be determined by what you, the player, are looking to get from the gameplay experience. I'd really love to hear your thoughts down below. This is Jarbo Gaming. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.
True aspirations of